Hello and welcome back, and everybody, today I got another deck tech here for you. Funny story about this one. So I used to have my second deck I ever built for Commander was an Edgar Markov vampire deck. Obviously that's what he does, and I played it for a while and I realized it was just a little too strong for my play group. Obviously I didn't know too much about the format and I didn't know how strong he was going to be compared to some of my other friends' decks. It was just they couldn't really play in the same pod. I mean, they could, but sometimes you'd win, sometimes you lose. I kind of powered it down just to do that, and then I just kind of put it on the shelf for a long time. I didn't really play him, and recently, a couple months before Commander Masters, I sold off my Edgar Markov just in case he got reprinted, and I didn't really want to play him anymore, so I decided to sell it off. However, I still really like vampires, and so I wanted to turn what I had as my Markov deck into another one, and so I searched up the vampire commanders that sounded the most fun to me, and the one that I landed on was Strefan Maurer Progenitor. It's 2, a black and a red for a 3/2 vampire noble with flying. It says at the beginning of your end step, create a blood token for each player who lost life this turn. Also, whenever Strefan attacks, you may sacrifice 2 blood tokens. If you do, you may put a vampire card from your hand onto the battlefield, tapped and attacking, and it gains indestructible until end of turn. So at first, when I first saw this card, it's been about, 2 years now since Crimson Vow came out, and I wasn't really impressed with this guy at first because I didn't really like the blood token thing. I still don't think they're very good if you're going to use them for their own ability, but I found out that there's other ways that you could use them, such as obviously his own ability, and there's other things you can do with them to gain some value besides their own activated ability. So the first thing we're going to need to do in this deck is make sure that we have blood tokens. Obviously our commander already does that, but it does it on the end step. So if we want to get that trigger on the very first turn that he comes out, we're going to need to give him haste, and we're going to need to already have blood tokens on the field. So we're going to start with the blood tokens here first. First up, I got Angie, Maid of Dishonor, 2, a black and a red for a 4/5 vampire. Whenever Angie, Maid of Dishonor, and or one or more other vampires enter the battlefield under your control, create a blood token. This ability triggers only once each turn. You could also pay 2 and sacrifice another creature or blood token, and each opponent loses 2 life and you gain 2 life. So that's a good example of one of those other ways that we can use the blood tokens besides their own ability. So if we do have enough mana late in the game, we can end up using this to hopefully drain out our opponents, or say we're going to die, we need to gain some life. That is a nice way we can do that. One of the better cards that give us blood tokens, we got Glass Cast Heart. It's 2 and a black for an artifact. Whenever one or more vampires you control attack, create a blood token. You can also pay a black and tap this and pay 1 life to create a 1/1 white and black vampire creature token with lifelink. You can also pay double black, tap, and sacrifice Glass Cast Heart and 13 blood tokens. Each opponent loses 13 life and you gain 13 life. So depending on how many blood tokens we can actually make with this deck, that could be a viable strategy to, I don't know, maybe finish somebody off. It'll gain us a bunch of life at the very least, and it gets us a lot of blood tokens for our commander's ability and some of our other abilities. Another really strong one here, we got Olivia's Attendants, 4 red for a 6/6 vampire with menace. It says whenever Olivia's Attendants deals damage, create that many blood tokens. You can also pay 2 and a red. Olivia's Attendants deal 1 damage to any target. You probably won't be using that one. You're probably just going to be swinging in. So this can actually get you tokens off of not only damage to your opponents, but just damage in general. So if this thing swings, so I'm not sure about this one, but since she has menace and you have to block with 2 creatures, and if you're doing 6 damage to each of those creatures, does that mean you'll get 12? Or you only get 6. Not 100% sure on that one, but at the very least you get 6 when this gets blocked, or even when you hit your opponents. So that's a pretty good rate of exchange on the blood tokens here for just a 6-drop that you could also cheat out with your commander. Next up, Voldaren Bloodcaster, 1 and a black for a 2/1 vampire wizard flying. Whenever Voldaren Bloodcaster or another non-token creature you control dies, create a blood token. And whenever you create a blood token, if you control 5 or more blood tokens, you transform Voldaren Bloodcaster into Bloodbat Summoner. It's a 3/3 vampire wizard with flying. It says at the beginning of combat on your turn, up to 1 target blood token you control becomes a 2/2 black bat creature with flying and haste in addition to its other types. So like I was saying earlier, there are other ways to use our blood tokens, and this is one of them. If we have an army of our blood tokens, we can on each combat turn them into 2/2s that can chip in for some damage, especially because they're in the air, or just have a nice blocker for us. That's also good too. Next, I'm going to go over just some of the notable vampires in the deck that don't really fit into any other categories except that you just want to be playing vampires, and they're pretty strong on their own. Since our commander does cheat mana costs here for our vampires in our hand, I did want to throw in some of the higher cost vampires that I wasn't able to play in the Markov deck. You know, that one was all about the 1s and 2 drops. This one I can play this 5, 6, and 7 drops. So first up here, I got Sengir the Dark Baron. It's 4 black for a 4/4 vampire noble with flying. It says whenever another creature dies, put 2 +1/+1 counters on Sengir the Dark Baron. That includes your creatures and your opponent's creatures. Also, Also, whenever another player loses the game, you gain life equal to that player's life total as the turn began. So this guy just becomes a huge threat in the air, and once it does take somebody out, you have the possibility of gaining a lot of life, thus putting you a little bit farther ahead. Since vampires are kind of known for their lifelink in some aspects, it is nice that we're going to be paying life for some of our abilities, and we're also going to be gaining life off of stuff like Sangir. Next up here, I got the Haunt of Hightower, 4 black, another 6 drop for a 3/3 vampire with flying and lifelink. There's that lifelink for you. Whenever the Haunt of Hightower attacks, defending player discards a card. That's always good. Whenever a card is put into an opponent's graveyard from anywhere, including the battlefield, library, discarding anything, you put a +1/+1 counter on the Haunt of Hightower. So you kill things, you have them discard cards, this thing just gets bigger, it's also in the air, gains you a lot of life. I love this one. Definitely an auto include in this deck. Another really fun one here. I like this card a lot. Super interesting design. It might even be a cool commander on its own. It's I don't know how to say this. I think it's Timothar, Baron of Bats, 4 black for a 4/4 vampire noble, and has a ward, discard a card, so that's a great ward. Also, it says whenever another non-token vampire you control dies, you may pay 1 and exile it. If you do, create a 1/1 black bat creature token with flying. It gains when this creature deals combat damage to a player, sacrifice it, and return the exile card to the battlefield tapped. This is just such a genius card design with vampires. They're gonna die, they turn into bats, you hit somebody with the bat, and they come back to life. It's super cool. I love this card. I like that you don't actually need to keep him on the battlefield to get those bats to get their exiled card back, because they gain the ability to do that, so that's pretty nice. Even if they target your Tim, you still get your cards back and they won't stay in exile. Once we get all these big ol' scary vampires on the battlefield, how are we gonna win? I think we all know. Pretty much like combat damage and or some of our gain drain effects. So we're gonna wanna buff up our creatures. So first up here, we got Bloodlord of Voskoth, 3 black for a 3/3 vampire warrior with Bloodthirst 3. And Bloodthirst, for those who don't know, is if an opponent was dealt damage this turn, this creature enters the battlefield with 3 +1/+1 counters on it. So if you hit your opponents or they lost life at all and this comes in, it comes in as a 6/6 flyer, so that is pretty strong. However, even better, whenever you cast a vampire creature spell, it gains Bloodthirst 3. So this one gives every single one of your vampires 3 +1/+1 counters on it, and the only thing you have to do is make sure one of your opponents was dealt damage this turn. I think this card is fantastic in buffing up all your vampires. This can really help close out games for you. Similarly, I got Patron of the Vein, 4 black for a 4/4 vampire shaman with flying. When Patron of the Vein enters the battlefield, destroy target creature an opponent controls. That's fantastic on its own. Pairs really well with that Timothar because you'll be getting it back onto the field, reuse that ETB trigger. However, it also says whenever a creature an opponent controls dies, exile it and put a +1/+1 counter on each vampire you control. So whenever you kill your opponent's creatures, we have a lot of kill spells in this deck. You kill your opponent's creatures, they die in combat, anything like that, they exile, which is great on its own just because you don't want your opponents to be able to reuse the cards that go to their graveyard. You want them exiled. That's fantastic. Also, it pumps your entire board, and that is also really, really strong. Next up, I got Crossway Troublemakers, another 6 drop, 5 and a black for a 5/5 vampire. Attacking vampires you control have Death Touch and Lifelink. Amazing on its own. Getting you all that life and giving everything Death Touch is just fantastic. Whenever a vampire you control dies, however, you may pay 2 life if you do draw a card. So that's where the Lifelink comes in handy. If you're going to be using all this life, I have a Boa Citadel in the deck too, other things that are going to be draining us for life, you're going to want that Lifelink. So getting out your Crossway Troublemakers to gain all that life is going to be really beneficial. Also, if your vampires happen to die in combat or anything, all you do is pay 2 life and you draw a card off of that. This card's wonderful in the deck. I like this one a lot. Lastly, for our buffs I'm talking about here, we got Zagreus, Thief of Heartbeats, 4 a black and a red for a 4/4 vampire rogue. It says this spell costs 1 less to cast for each creature in your party, which can come up. Your party consists of clerics, warriors, wizards, and rogues. So there's several different vampires that have those creature types, so it could actually end up costing less. He also has flying, death touch, and haste, and he also gives other creatures you control death touch. And whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to a planeswalker, destroy that planeswalker. So they got death touch and, I don't know, planeswalker touch, I guess you can say, but planeswalker death touch. So fun fact, I haven't made a video on this guy yet, but this is my very first commander deck that I ever built, was this guy. I still have it together. It's gone through many iterations, so I don't really know how to make a video on it because I'm still working on it. It's gone through, a Voltron thing, more of a pinger thing, mass board wipe thing. There's so many different stages that I've taken this commander. So maybe one day when I have it where I want it to be, I will make a video on it. However, I just wanted to throw this in here because he is one of my favorite cards in the game. He's my very first commander, so he's very close to my heart, and I wanted to throw him in my vampire deck. And plus, he's really strong too, so can't go wrong with that. Next up, we're going to go over some of the draw in the deck. Firstly, we got Champion of Dusk, 3 black for a 4/4 vampire knight. It says when Champion of Dusk enters the battlefield, you draw X cards and lose X life, where X is the number of vampires you control. Pretty straightforward. Play this guy when your board is full of vamps, and you'll be drawing tons tons of cards. Careful that you don't kill yourself though, because this is not a May ability. You do lose the life and you draw the cards if this guy comes in the field, so be careful with that one if you are pretty low on life. Next up here, I got Blood Tracker 3 and a black for a 2/2 Vampire Wizard with Flying. It has black, pay 2 life, put a +1/+1 counter on Blood Tracker, and when Blood Tracker leaves the battlefield, draw a card for each +1/+1 counter on it. So I think most of the time we're not even going to have to use that ability to put counters on him, since vampires are so good at putting counters on each other on their own. I think it's very likely that we're going to have some of our other guys, such as Patron of the Vein, out to help put counters on our Blood Tracker. That way when he leaves, we'll draw tons of cards. And of course you got the usual black draw spells, Sign in Blood, those kind of things, but I wanted to throw in Pointed Discussion into the deck. It is 3 mana, so it's probably 1 more than the average rate. 2 and a black for a sorcery. You draw 2 cards, lose 2 life, then create a blood token. So I want to throw it in for the synergy. Creating the blood token is always nice. Plus it's really flavorful. Lastly here, we got Phyrexian Arena. Obviously everybody knows this card. Why are you talking about it? Might as well go through it real quick. 1 black enchantment. At the beginning of your upkeep, you draw a card, lose a life. Format staple for the longest time. However, the reason I threw this one in here, and a lot of these draw spells in here, are because remember that phrase on our commander that says at the beginning of your end step, create a blood token for each player who lost life this turn. So you want to be consistently losing life on your own turns. 1's fine. 1's all you need. Just lose 1 life, and then that gets you another 1 of your blood tokens on your end step. And then you're going to want to be doing damage to all your opponents. That way you're going to be getting the maximum amount of blood tokens per turn. So that's why I threw Phyrexian Arena in this one. Plus Read the Bones, Sign in Blood, all the different ones that lose you life. Next up here, we're going to go through some of our removal in the deck. Some of the more thematic ones we got here. Vampire's Vengeance. First off, 2 and a red for an instant. Vampire's Vengeance deals 2 damage to each non-vampire creature, and you create a blood token. So it's a mini board wipe. You can get rid of those really small 1/1s or 2/2s that your opponents have while creating a blood token in the process. I really like this one for 3 mana. I think it could really hose some, elf ball decks or any other small creature decks, squirrel decks, whatever your opponents are playing that have small tokens. That one can be really useful for you. Another one similarly on a bigger scale though, Olivia's Wrath, 4 and a black for a sorcery. Each non-vampire creature gets -X/-X until end of turn, where X is the number of vampires you control. So you'll notice in the instants and sorceries that are themed around vampires, they really care about the number of vampires you control, and they don't like to hurt each other. They're really good at not hurting themselves and hurting opponents, creatures, other creature types. So I think later in the game, when you're going to go for that alpha strike, kill everybody, cast this first, wipe out all your opponents' boards, because most players aren't playing. Vampires aren't just like a common creature type. Most people are not just using vampires regularly in their normal decks. So I think this will wipe out most of your opponent's board to be able to go in and kill them with them. Next up, I got Midnight Arsonist, 3 and a red for a 3/2 vampire. When Midnight Arsonist enters the battlefield, destroy up to X target artifacts without mana abilities, where X is the number of vampires you control. Again, another one that cares about the number of vampires you control. So this is pretty similar to a Vandal Blast, which we do also have in the deck, but I like this one because it's more thematic. It is a vampire. It could also be buffed up by your other guys. This really kills any sort of equipment deck, any sort of artifact theme. It's nice to have 2 versions of this style of effect with this and Vandal Blast in the deck, just in case you run into those really pesky artifact decks. Lastly, I got Markov Enforcer, one of the coolest cards in this deck by far. 4 red for a 6/6 vampire soldier. When Markov Enforcer or another vampire enters the battlefield under your control, Markov Enforcer fights up to 1 target creature an opponent controls. So you got to be careful with that ability right there, because it's not a May. It has to fight. So if you end up fighting 6 or higher power collectively, your Markov Enforcer will die. So be careful with that. However, it also says whenever a creature dealt damage by Markov Enforcer this turn dies, you create a blood token. So this card's just fantastic. You can take out 5 1/1s with this ability if you have 5 vampires entering the field. I think the flavor on this is just so on point. The art is awesome. Creating blood tokens is super good. Playing vampires, killing your opponent's stuff, also awesome. We like that a lot. Last but not least, you know me, I like to go into the general utility of the deck. Just cards that make the deck flow more smoothly. So first up here, I got Strionic Resonator, a 2 mana artifact. Pay 2, tap, copy target triggered ability you control. You may choose new targets for the copy. You might be thinking, why do you have Strionic Resonator in this Vampire Rakdos deck? Very strange. However, this pairs extremely well with our commander. So I'll read them again. It says whenever Strefan attacks, you may sacrifice 2 blood tokens. If you do, you may put a vampire card from your hand onto the battlefield tapped and attacking. It gains indestructible until end of turn. So with this out, you pay 2 additional mana mana, tap the Strefan Resonator, point it at your Strefan's ability. I think you do have to sacrifice 2 more blood tokens, but I don't think that should be a problem. You should have generally enough. And then you can shoot out 2 vampires per turn. That is insane value since we have so many high-costed 6-drop vampires in the deck. Next, I got Cemetery Gatekeeper, 1 and a red for a 2/1 vampire with first strike. It says when Cemetery Gatekeeper enters the battlefield, exile a card from a graveyard. Doesn't have to be yours. It could be your opponent's, it can be anybody's. And it says whenever a player plays a land or casts a spell, if it shares a card type with the exiled card, Cemetery Gatekeeper deals 2 damage to that player. Again, this harkens back to our draw spells. We want to be taking damage just as much as our opponents, at least once on our turn. Probably don't want to be doing creature. You might want to do land or something so you can get it at least once per turn. You know, you play your land drop, you take the 2 damage, then you get the blood token on your end step. However, if you're playing against, you know, say a instant or sorcery theme, you can exile somebody's instant from their graveyard, and then any time that they play an instant, they'll be taking 2 damage. That is pretty good right on its own. Last but not least here, I got Haunting Voyage. It's 4 black for a sorcery. It says choose a creature type, return up to 2 creatures of that type from your graveyard to the battlefield. If this spell was foretold, return all creature cards of that type from your graveyard to the battlefield instead. It also has Foretell for 5 black, so it costs 1 more to foretell it. Also, you have to pay the 2 to put it into Foretell, and then later you can cast it for its Foretell cost. This is super good to have in Foretell really early. That way, later in the game, after a few board wipes or whatever, you can cast your Haunting Voyage for 7 mana, bring back every single one of your vampires to the field. Really just hose your opponents, especially the turn after a board wipe, and they're still trying to rebuild. You can come back in hot, give your creatures some haste with your anger or whatever. I have a few different options in the deck, and that could really turn the tide of a game with just this card right here. So that's pretty much it for my Strefan deck. Strefan, however you say that. I am such a big fan of vampires in general, in lore, in Magic in general, you know, like Dracula, all those kind of things. Big fan of Vampire Diaries, if anybody's seen that. I think it would be really cool to have Strefan be an alter of Stefan from that show. I think that would just be pretty funny because their names are so similar. So that's pretty much all I got for this guy. It seems actually really fun, and it's not going to be very expensive for me to alter that deck that I had into this one. So it's not much lost if I end up not liking the deck, but I did want to put it together, and I thought I might as well make a video on it. So thank you guys so much for watching. If you want to check out my full deck list, it is down in the description. And until next time, go ahead and subscribe down below if you like my content and you would like to see more from me, and I will see you guys in the next video. All right, take care.